The blood had long since dried on the hospital floor where Margaret Ellis first saw him, but the stain on her memory remained fresh even 44 years later. October 2001. The leaves outside Plainfield General Hospital were turning the color of rust, and inside room 237, an 83-year-old woman was finally ready to speak about the monster she once nursed back to health. Margaret Ellis died 3 days after this conversation. Some say it was cancer. Others whisper that some secrets are too heavy for the human soul to carry. Her voice trembled as she spoke into the tape recorder, each word measured like drops of poison. "They brought him in bleeding," she said, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the white hospital sheets. November 1957. Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, and I was the one assigned to keep him alive. The fluorescent lights above her bed flickered with the rhythm of a dying heart, casting shadows that seemed to move independently across the sterile walls. Outside, the Wisconsin wind howled through the empty corridors of memory, carrying with it the echoes of screams that had been silenced decades ago. Before we continue, if you can still hear my voice, it means you haven't looked away. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but to see what others are too afraid to know. Margaret's confession would shatter everything we thought we knew about America's most notorious killer. Because what she revealed in those final hours wasn't just about Ed Gein. It was about a network of silence that reached from the cornfields of Wisconsin to the marble halls of Washington, D.C., where men in suits decided which truths could live and which must die. The year was 1957, and America was drowning in its own darkness. The Cold War had turned neighbor against neighbor, paranoia seeping through suburban walls like radioactive fog. In Nevada, atomic bombs painted the desert sky in shades of apocalypse while children practiced hiding under school desks. In Virginia, CIA scientists were dosing unwitting subjects with LSD, watching them fracture like broken mirrors in underground laboratories that officially didn't exist. And in a small Wisconsin farmhouse, something far more primitive was stirring, something that would make the government's experiments look like child's play. The town of Plainfield had always been a place where secrets grew like weeds in untended graves. Population 647. Everyone knew everyone else's business, except for what happened behind the rotting wood of the Gein farmhouse. The locals had their suspicions about Ed and his mother Augusta, but suspicion was a luxury they couldn't afford in a place where survival depended on minding your own business. When the deputies finally broke down that door on November 16, 1957, they found a charnel house that defied human comprehension. Lampshades made of human skin, bowls carved from skulls, a vest of breasts, a box of noses, and hanging from a beam in the shed, the headless, gutted corpse of Bernice Worden, suspended like a deer ready for butchering. But what they found in Ed Gein's kitchen would remain classified for the next 44 years. Deputy Arthur Schley, a man who had seen action in Korea and thought he understood violence, took one look at that kitchen and vomited until blood came up. Sheriff Art Schindler, who discovered the scene, would never speak of what he saw there, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to the FBI agents who arrived within hours, their black sedans cutting through the November frost like sharks through dark water. The official reports were sanitized, scrubbed clean of the most disturbing details. The public was told about the lampshades and the skulls, carefully catalogued horrors that were shocking enough to satisfy their morbid curiosity while hiding the deeper truth. Because what Ed Gein had been doing in that farmhouse wasn't just murder. It was research. Margaret Ellis remembered the first time she saw him. strapped to a gurney in the emergency room of Plainfield General Hospital. He had been beaten during his arrest. Deputy Schley had lost control when he saw Bernice Worden's body, delivering kicks and punches that left Gein with 3 broken ribs and a fractured skull. But it wasn't the physical wounds that disturbed Margaret. It was his eyes. They were completely calm. She whispered into the tape recorder, her voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital's life support machines. Not the eyes of a madman. Not the eyes of someone who had just been caught committing unspeakable acts. They were the eyes of a scientist who had been interrupted in the middle of an important experiment. The attending physician, Dr. Harold Brennan, had assigned Margaret to Gein's case because she was known for her discretion. She had treated other sensitive patients before: a state senator's son who had overdosed on heroin, a judge's wife who bore the bruises of domestic violence, a military contractor who arrived with radiation burns and no explanation. Margaret knew how to see without seeing, to hear without listening, to forget on command. But Ed Gein was different. During those first 72 hours in the hospital, as FBI agents and state investigators swarmed through Plainfield like antibodies responding to an infection, Margaret watched Gein with growing unease. He ate his meals methodically, thanking her politely after each serving. He asked about her family, inquired about the weather, discussed the harvest season with the casual interest of a farmer concerned about his crops. And late at night, when the hospital corridors were empty except for the ghost shift nurses padding silently between rooms, she heard him talking to himself in a language she didn't recognize. Not German, though his family had emigrated from there. Not any Native American dialect, though some locals whispered that the Gein property sat on an old burial ground. It was something older, something that made the hair on her arms stand up and her teeth ache with a frequency that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly in her bones. On the 3rd night, she made a mistake. She listened at his door. Transcript. Recovered from Margaret Ellis' personal journal, November 19, 1957. He was reciting names, not the names of his victims. We all knew those by then. Bernice Worden, Mary Hogan. The others they suspected but could never prove. These were different names. European names, French names, names with dates attached, 1673, 1742, 1889, names of people who had been dead for centuries. But the way he spoke them, it was like he was reading from a roll call, like he was reporting to someone, or something. The FBI agents who questioned Gein during his hospital stay were careful to keep their conversations private. But Margaret's nursing station was positioned directly across from his room, and sound carried strangely in the old hospital's acoustics. Through the thin walls, she heard fragments of conversations that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Special Agent Robert Morrison, assigned to the case from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, seemed less interested in Gein's crimes than in his methods. "How did you know?" Morrison asked during one session. "How did you know which parts to take, which organs to preserve, the positioning of the bodies? Where did you learn that?" Gein's responses were always measured, thoughtful. "Mother taught me," he would say. "Mother knew the old ways, the necessary ways, the ways that keep the door open between this world and the next. If you're still here, it means you're one of the few who search for truth in the dark." Subscribe, because stories like this don't stay online for long. Margaret began to notice patterns in Gein's visitors. Beyond the obvious investigators and psychiatrists, there were others. Men in expensive suits who arrived in government vehicles but carried no visible identification. Scientists from universities she had never heard of. carrying briefcases filled with papers covered in diagrams that looked more like anatomical charts than police evidence. Military personnel who spoke in whispers about applications and potential developments and national security implications. Dr. Franz Schneider was the most frequent of these unofficial visitors. A German émigré who claimed to be a professor of anthropology from the University of Chicago, Schneider spent hours with Gein discussing what he euphemistically called traditional European preservation techniques. Margaret later learned that Schneider had worked for the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization dedicated to researching ancient Germanic rituals and occult practices, before disappearing at the end of World War II and resurfacing in America under Operation Paperclip. The conversations between Schneider and Gein were conducted in that same strange language Margaret had heard Gein speaking to himself. But occasionally they would slip into English, and the fragments she caught were more disturbing than anything in the official police reports. The ceremonial arrangement of the organs, Schneider would say, his accent thick with Germanic precision. This knowledge, where did it originate? Your mother, you say, but where did she learn? These are practices that date back to the medieval period, to the time when the boundary between life and death was understood to be more permeable. Gein would respond in that calm, matter-of-fact voice that had chilled Margaret from the beginning. Mother said the dead don't stay dead unless you know how to keep them that way. She showed me the books, the old books, from the old country, books that came with great-grandmother when she crossed the ocean. And the subjects you chose, Schneider continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Middle-aged women, maternal figures. This was intentional? They had to be the right age, Gein explained. The right condition. Mother was very specific about that. Too young and the preservation doesn't take properly. Too old and the essence has already begun to fade. But women of a certain age, women who have carried life within them, women who understand suffering, they hold the energy longer. Margaret's hands shook as she wrote in her journal that night. She was beginning to understand that what had happened at the Gein farmhouse was not random violence or simple madness. It was a systematic process, guided by principles that had been passed down through generations of what could only be described as practitioners. The cover-up began almost immediately. Files disappeared from the sheriff's office. Evidence was reclassified as sensitive material and transferred to federal custody. Witnesses were relocated or quietly discredited. The Gein farmhouse, which should have been preserved as a crime scene, was mysteriously destroyed by fire just 6 months after Ed's arrest, taking with it any physical evidence of the kitchen laboratory that had so disturbed Deputy Schley. Margaret discovered the extent of the suppression when she tried to submit her nursing notes to the official investigation. Dr. Brennan, the attending physician who had been so supportive during Gein's treatment, suddenly became evasive and hostile when she mentioned her observations about the unusual visitors and strange conversations. "You're a nurse, Margaret," he told her, his voice carrying a warning that made her blood run cold. "You're trained to observe medical symptoms, not to speculate about other matters. I suggest you focus on your actual responsibilities and forget about anything you think you might have seen or heard." When she persisted, asking about Dr. Schneider and the government agents who had spent so much time with Gein, Brennan's facade of professional courtesy dropped entirely. "Those men don't exist," he said flatly. "They were never here, and if you continue to suggest otherwise, you'll find that your employment at this hospital and your nursing license in the state of Wisconsin might come under review." The message was clear: silence or consequences. But Margaret Ellis was not easily intimidated. She had served as a military nurse in Korea, had seen young men torn apart by shrapnel and machine gun fire, had held dying soldiers while they called for their mothers in a dozen different languages. She understood fear, but she also understood duty. That night, she made copies of everything: her nursing notes, her personal journal entries, even the visitor logs that showed the mysterious arrivals and departures of people who officially didn't exist. She hid these copies in a safety deposit box in a bank 3 towns over, telling no one, not even her husband, about what she had preserved. The official story of Ed Gein became the stuff of legend, the butcher of Plainfield. The inspiration for Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and countless other horror stories. A deranged mama's boy who killed 2 women and desecrated graves to create grotesque furniture from human remains. A monster, certainly, but an explicable one. Mental illness combined with rural isolation and an unhealthy relationship with his domineering mother. But the real story, the story that Margaret Ellis carried in silence for 44 years, was far more disturbing than any Hollywood horror film could capture. Because Ed Gein wasn't just a killer, he was a conduit, a link in a chain that stretched back centuries, connecting the ancient death cults of medieval Europe to the secret laboratories of Cold War America. His crimes weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated rituals designed to test the boundaries between life and death, to explore the possibility of preserving human consciousness beyond physical mortality. The books that Gein claimed his mother had inherited from his great-grandmother were real. Margaret had seen them briefly when FBI agents carried them out of the farmhouse in unmarked crates. Ancient volumes bound in materials she preferred not to identify, filled with diagrams and instructions that predated modern medical knowledge by hundreds of years, yet displayed an understanding of human anatomy that wouldn't be matched by legitimate science until the late 20th century. These texts described techniques for preserving organs, for maintaining tissue viability after death, for creating what could only be called vessels capable of housing consciousness that had been separated from its original physical form. The lampshades and bowls and clothing that horrified investigators weren't trophies or souvenirs. They were components in a larger apparatus, pieces of a machine designed to blur the line between the living and the dead. Dr. Schneider and his colleagues weren't just studying Gein's methods out of academic curiosity, they were collecting data for practical application. In the depths of the Cold War, when both American and Soviet scientists were exploring every possible avenue for gaining strategic advantage, the possibility of transcending death itself was too valuable to ignore. Margaret learned about Project Lazarus purely by accident when she overheard a telephone conversation between Dr. Brennan and someone he addressed only as Director. The project, as far as she could piece together from fragments of overheard conversations, was an attempt to apply Gein's preservation techniques to military applications. The goal was to create a form of battlefield immortality that would allow soldiers to continue fighting even after sustaining injuries that would normally be fatal. The research was being conducted at a facility that Brennan referred to only as the farm, somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. Test subjects included terminal patients from military hospitals, volunteers from maximum security prisons, and, according to one conversation that made Margaret's skin crawl, procurement from international sources, a euphemism that suggested human trafficking on an industrial scale. Gein himself was transferred from Plainfield to this facility after his brief hospital stay, though official records showed him being committed to the Wisconsin State Hospital for the criminally insane. The man who appeared at his trial in 1968 was someone Margaret didn't recognize, a hollow-eyed shell who bore only a superficial resemblance to the calm, calculating individual she had nursed back to health. The cover-up extended beyond simple document classification. Witnesses died in accidents that were statistically improbable. Deputy Schley, who had discovered Gein's kitchen laboratory, was killed in a car crash just 2 years after the arrest. Sheriff Schindler died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 43, despite having no history of cardiac problems. Dr. Brennan was found dead in his office from an apparent suicide, leaving behind a note apologizing for participating in research that should never have been attempted. Margaret survived because she had learned the first rule of handling dangerous secrets. Never let anyone know you have them until you're ready to use them. She continued working as a nurse for another 20 years, maintaining perfect silence about what she had witnessed. She married, raised children, lived what appeared to be a completely normal life. But every November 16th, on the anniversary of Gein's arrest, she would drive to that bank 3 towns over and add another page to the collection hidden in her safety deposit box. Details she had remembered, connections she had made, evidence she had quietly gathered over the decades, because Margaret Ellis understood something that the men in expensive suits had underestimated. Nurses see everything, remember everything, and when they finally decide to speak, the truth they reveal can topple governments. Her cancer diagnosis came in the summer of 2001. Aggressive, inoperable. 6 months to live, the doctors said, though Margaret suspected that timeline wasn't entirely natural. She had noticed the strange vehicles following her to medical appointments, the unusual interest from insurance investigators, the way her medical files seemed to be reviewed by people who weren't her doctors. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to die quietly and take her secrets to the grave. Instead, she contacted a journalist. Not one of the mainstream reporters who would sanitize her story or bury it under legal challenges, but an independent investigator who specialized in government cover-ups and had the courage to publish material that others wouldn't touch. The interview took place in her hospital room on October 20th, 2001. Margaret had refused pain medication for the session, wanting her mind completely clear as she finally revealed what she had carried in silence for nearly half a century. "They're still out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a conviction that made the recording equipment seem to amplify her words. The project didn't end with Gein's trial. It expanded. What they learned from him, what they discovered in those ancient books, it opened doors that should have remained sealed forever. She spoke for 3 hours, detailing everything from her first encounter with Gein to the systematic elimination of witnesses, from the mysterious Dr. Schneider to the ongoing research at facilities that existed only in classified budgets and congressional black projects. She provided names, dates, locations, enough evidence to launch investigations that could reshape our understanding of Cold War-era human experimentation. But the most disturbing revelation came at the end of the interview, when Margaret described what she called the harvest. Gein wasn't the only one, she said. He was part of a network, small towns across rural America, isolated communities where disappearances wouldn't be noticed or investigated too closely. Each location had a practitioner, someone trained in the old methods, someone capable of providing the raw materials for Project Lazarus. She named 12 locations across 7 states. Plainfield was just the beginning. The bodies they found at Gein's farmhouse were only a fraction of what was collected, Margaret continued. Most of the harvest was transported to the research facilities before investigators arrived. What they left behind was carefully staged to support the story of a lone madman. But Gein was never alone. He was never acting independently. He was following orders from people who understood exactly what they were asking him to do. The journalist pressed for more details about the network, about the current status of the research, about the possibility that the harvesting was still continuing. Margaret's responses grew more and more disturbing. "They've perfected the process now," she said. "What took Gein months to accomplish, they can do in hours. What required crude preservation techniques in 1957 can now be achieved with technologies that don't officially exist. The line between life and death isn't just blurred anymore. In their laboratories, it's been completely erased." She died 3 days later, officially from complications related to her cancer. The journalist who interviewed her was found dead in his apartment 2 weeks after that, apparently from a drug overdose despite having no history of substance abuse. The recording of Margaret's confession disappeared from police evidence, though copies had already been distributed to several international news organizations. Share this before it disappears. And subscribe, not to follow, but to remember, because some truths only survive when someone keeps them alive. The official investigation into Margaret Ellis's claims was brief and predictably inconclusive. Federal authorities determined that she had been suffering from terminal illness-related delusions, and that her testimony contained no actionable intelligence. The locations she had named were deemed not credible without explanation. The documents she claimed to have preserved were never found, despite extensive searches of multiple bank safety deposit boxes. But in the months following her death, strange patterns began to emerge. Researchers who had worked on classified military projects during the Cold War began suffering a statistically improbable number of fatal accidents. Veterans who had been treated at certain military hospitals during the 1960s and 1970s reported memories of medical procedures that didn't appear in their official records. Small-town coroners across rural America quietly noted unusually high rates of unexplained deaths among middle-aged women, deaths that shared certain characteristics that reminded them of old crime scene photos from Wisconsin. The farmhouse where Ed Gein committed his crimes was rebuilt twice after the mysterious fire, but both structures suffered unexplained structural failures within months of completion. Local contractors reported tools that moved by themselves, electrical systems that failed without cause, and a pervasive smell of decay that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. The property remains empty today, officially designated as environmentally unsuitable for construction by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. In Plainfield, old-timers still whisper about the visitors who come every November, driving expensive cars with government plates, carrying briefcases, and wearing expressions of men who are searching for something they hope never to find. They spend hours at the Plainfield Cemetery, studying graves with an intensity that has nothing to do with genealogy or historical research. They ask questions about families that moved away decades ago, about children who disappeared during the harsh winters of the 1950s and 1960s, about local folklore concerning the thin places where the living world touches something else. And sometimes, late at night when the Wisconsin wind carries the scent of old snow and older secrets, residents report hearing sounds from the direction of the old Gein property. Not the sounds of wildlife or weather, but something more methodical. Something that sounds almost like construction work, as if someone is still building something out there in the darkness, following blueprints that were drafted in blood and bound in human skin. Margaret Ellis kept her silence for 44 years because she understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to speak aloud. But as she lay dying in that hospital room, listening to the same fluorescent lights that had flickered above Ed Gein's bed decades earlier, she realized that silence itself had become a form of complicity. The harvest continues. The research progresses. The boundary between life and death grows thinner with each passing year, not through natural evolution, but through the deliberate manipulation of forces that were never meant to be controlled by human hands, and somewhere in the classified depths of facilities that don't appear on any map in laboratories funded by budgets that don't officially exist, the work that began in a Wisconsin farmhouse continues to push against the fundamental limitations of human mortality. Margaret Ellis died believing that her confession would expose the truth and stop the horror. But the men in expensive suits had learned something from their decades of experience managing inconvenient revelations. Sometimes the best way to hide the truth is to let people hear it and then dismiss it as the ravings of a dying woman. After all, who would believe such an impossible story? Some stories were never meant to be told. But now that you've heard it, there's no way to unhear it. The recording ends with the sound of Margaret Ellis's final breath, followed by 43 seconds of silence broken only by the mechanical rhythm of hospital machinery registering the absence of a heartbeat. In that silence, if you listen carefully with headphones turned to maximum volume, you can hear something else, something that sounds almost like whispered names being read from a very long list in a language that predates any modern tongue. The names of the harvested, the names of those who died to feed an appetite that has grown stronger with each passing decade. And at the very end, barely audible beneath the static, Margaret Ellis's voice speaks one final time. They're coming for more. The recording cuts off. The silence that follows is deeper than death itself.